For nearly half a century, the world was divided in two. On one side, the capitalist West, led by the United States. On the other, a communist superpower that stretched from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean, the Soviet Union. It was the largest country on Earth, a nuclear giant, a space pioneer, a regime that claimed to represent the future of humanity. And then in 1991, it simply disappeared. This is the story of how one of the most powerful empires in history collapsed, not from invasion, but from within. To understand how the Soviet Union collapsed, we have to understand why it was created. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Russian Empire was vast, stretching across Europe and Asia. It was ruled by one man, Nicholas II, an absolute monarch. No real parliament, no democratic accountability, a rigid autocracy in an age of rising industrial powers. While Western Europe modernized, Russia lagged behind. Millions of peasants lived in poverty. Industrial workers faced brutal conditions. Political dissent was crushed by secret police. Then came World War I. Russia entered the war unprepared. Millions of soldiers died. The economy collapsed. Food shortages spread across major cities. By 1917, Petrograd was starving, and when people are starving, empires fall. In February 1917, mass protests erupted. The army refused to suppress them. Nicholas II abdicated. 300 years of Romanov rule ended in days. But the revolution did not bring stability. It created a power vacuum. Into that vacuum stepped the Bolsheviks. Led by Vladimir Lenin, they promised something radically different. Not reform, not constitutional monarchy, but total transformation. A dictatorship of the proletariat, the abolition of private property, the destruction of capitalism itself. In October 1917, they seized power in what became known as the October Revolution. But taking power was easier than keeping it. Russia plunged into civil war. Red Army versus White Army. Millions died between 1918 and 1921. Out of that chaos, the Bolsheviks emerged victorious. And in 1922, they formalized their new state, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. A union of republics, in theory voluntary, in reality tightly controlled from Moscow. It was not just a new government, it was an experiment, an attempt to redesign society from the ground up. And experiments at this scale always come with consequences. Out of civil war and collapse, the Soviet Union did not retreat. It accelerated. When Joseph Stalin consolidated power in the late 1920s, he launched one of the most aggressive modernization campaigns in history. 5-year plans, mass industrialization, forced collectivization of agriculture. The goal was simple: transform a largely agrarian society into an industrial superpower, and in a single generation. Factories rose where fields once stood. Steel production exploded. Dams, railways, and industrial cities were built at astonishing speed. But the cost was staggering. Peasants were forced into collective farms. Resistance was crushed. Famine swept across Ukraine and other regions. Millions were sent to labor camps. The Gulag system. The state grew stronger. The individual became expendable. Then came World War II. In 1941, Nazi Germany invaded. Entire cities were destroyed. More than 20 million Soviet citizens would die. But the Soviet Union did not collapse. It mobilized everything. Factories were dismantled and moved east. Production intensified. The Red Army pushed back. In 1945, Soviet troops raised their flag over Berlin. The USSR emerged victorious and transformed. It was no longer a revolutionary state. It was a global power. By 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb. The world had entered the nuclear age, a bipolar world. On one side, the United States. On the other, the Soviet Union. Two systems, two ideologies, two visions of the future. In 1957, Sputnik entered orbit. The first artificial satellite. The message was unmistakable. The Soviet Union could compete at the highest level of science and technology. Through the 1960s and 70s, it maintained military parity with the United States. It built a vast nuclear arsenal. It projected influence across Eastern Europe. It supported revolutionary movements abroad. To many, it seemed permanent, inevitable. But power built on fear, central control, and rigid planning carries hidden weaknesses. The economy prioritized heavy industry and weapons over consumer goods. Innovation was controlled, not spontaneous. Political dissent was suppressed, not debated. From the outside, it looked like a superpower. From the inside, it was becoming brittle, and brittle systems don't bend, they crack. From the outside, the Soviet Union looked stable, powerful, permanent. But beneath the surface, its economic engine was struggling to breathe. The Soviet system was based on central planning. In Moscow, bureaucrats decided what every factory would produce, how much it would produce, what raw materials it would receive, what price everything would cost. In theory, this eliminated chaos. In reality, it eliminated feedback. There were no market signals, no competition, no incentive to innovate. If a factory met its quota, it was considered successful, even if the products were defective, unwanted, or unusable. A nail factory once fulfilled its quota by producing nails so large they were practically useless. The numbers looked good on paper. Reality was different. By the 1970s, the cracks were visible. Productivity slowed dramatically. Technological development lagged behind the West, especially in computing and electronics. While Silicon Valley was emerging in the United States, Soviet factories were still struggling with outdated equipment. Consumer goods were chronically scarce. Citizens stood in long lines for basic items: meat, toilet paper, shoes. The system could build tanks. It struggled to build refrigerators. And yet, the crisis was masked. Why, you ask? Oil. The Soviet Union was one of the world's largest energy exporters. During the 1970s oil boom, high global prices flooded the state with revenue. The leadership did not reform the system. It subsidized it. Inefficient factories survived. Structural problems were postponed. The illusion of stability remained. But it was an illusion. Then, in the 1980s, oil prices collapsed. Revenue dropped sharply. At the same time, the arms race with the United States intensified. Military spending remained enormous. The Soviet economy was now trapped. It could not cut military power without weakening its global position. It could not modernize without destabilizing the system. It could not continue as it was without decline. A structural contradiction. By the early 1980s, growth had nearly stopped. Corruption increased, black markets expanded. Citizens increasingly compared their lives to the West through television, smuggled goods, and cultural exchange. The gap was obvious. The Soviet model promised abundance. It delivered stagnation. By 1985, the Soviet Union was old. Its leadership was aging. Its economy was stagnant. Its ideology felt frozen in time. Then something unusual happened. A younger man rose to power. Mikhail Gorbachev was 54 years old, dynamic, articulate, reform-minded. He understood what many inside the system already knew. The Soviet model was not working. Growth had stalled. Corruption was endemic. Public morale was declining. The question was no longer whether reform was necessary. The question was how much reform the system could survive. Gorbachev introduced Perestroika. He allowed limited private cooperatives. He reduced central planning controls. He encouraged modest decentralization of decision-making. For the first time since Lenin, small-scale private enterprise reappeared, but the reforms created a dangerous hybrid. The old system was weakened. The new system was incomplete. Prices were still distorted. Supply chains were disrupted. Production fell. Shortages worsened. Instead of gradual improvement, citizens experienced chaos. The economy was no longer fully controlled, but it was not yet functional. If Perestroika shook the economy, Glasnost shook the foundation of political control. Censorship was loosened. Political prisoners were released. Journalists began reporting on the crimes of Joseph Stalin, the scale of the Gulag, corruption inside the party, the true cost of the war in Afghanistan, the cover-ups surrounding Chernobyl. For decades, the state had controlled truth. Now truth became unpredictable. Citizens saw for the first time how much had been hidden. Gorbachev believed socialism could be reformed. He did not want to dismantle the Union. He wanted to modernize it. But the Soviet system had been built on control. Control of prices, control of information, control of political expression. Glasnost weakened ideological control. Perestroika weakened economic control. And the Communist Party was no longer unquestioned. In 1989, partially free elections were held for a new Congress of People's Deputies. Televised debates exposed deep divisions. Criticism became public. The monopoly of power was breaking. And once censorship fell, something else resurfaced. Memory. In Lithuania, in Latvia, in Estonia, in Ukraine, in the Caucasus. People began revisiting their history before Soviet rule. Old grievances resurfaced. Deportations, forced incorporation, suppressed identity. The Soviet Union had always described itself as a voluntary union of republics. Now those republics began asking, if it was voluntary, why couldn't we leave? By 1990, Gorbachev faced an impossible situation. Reform too slowly and the economy collapses. Reform too quickly and the union fractures. Conservatives accused him of destroying socialism. Reformers accused him of not going far enough. The system was suspended between two realities. No longer authoritarian enough to suppress dissent, not democratic enough to manage it. And once people begin speaking freely, they rarely ask for less freedom, they ask for sovereignty. The Soviet Union was often mistaken for Russia. It wasn't. It was a federation of 15 republics, stretching from the Baltic Sea to Central Asia. Different languages, different histories, different memories, and once Moscow loosened its grip, those memories returned. Some republics had never fully accepted Soviet rule. They had endured it. Now they began to test its limits. Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. Unlike many other republics, the Baltic states had been independent countries between the two world wars. In 1940, they were absorbed into the Soviet Union under the shadow of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. For decades, Moscow insisted this was voluntary. The Baltics never fully agreed. In 1989, nearly 2 million people formed a 600-kilometer human chain across the three republics, the Baltic Way. It was peaceful, symbolic, but unmistakable. In March 1990, Lithuania became the first republic to declare independence. Moscow responded with economic pressure. Then, in January 1991, Soviet troops moved into Vilnius. Tanks surrounded the television tower. Your civilians stood in front of them. 14 people were killed. But something had changed. The Kremlin hesitated to escalate. The world was watching, and the Soviet leadership was no longer willing or able to crush dissent on the scale of 1956 in Hungary or 1968 in Prague. The myth of irreversible control was broken. If Lithuania could challenge Moscow, others could too. In the Caucasus, the collapse looked different. It was not just about sovereignty, it was about territory and identity. Nagorno-Karabakh, a mountainous region inside Soviet Azerbaijan, but populated mostly by Armenians, became the center of a growing crisis. By the late 1980s, protests erupted. Violence followed. Ethnic clashes escalated into open warfare. The Soviet government tried to mediate. It failed. For decades, Moscow had frozen ethnic tensions under authoritarian control. Now, without fear holding everything together, old conflicts resurfaced. The Union was no longer managing its diversity. It was unraveling. But the true turning point came from Ukraine. Ukraine was not a peripheral republic. It was central, economically vital, strategically critical, home to millions of Soviet citizens, and a significant portion of the Soviet nuclear arsenal. In August 1991, after the failed coup in Moscow, Ukraine declared independence. In December, a national referendum was held. More than 90% voted in favor, not just in the west of the country, but across almost all regions. That result changed everything, because without Ukraine, the Soviet Union could not function as a great power. Its geography shrank and its population shrank. Its legitimacy collapsed. From that moment, the Union existed mostly on paper. Kazakhstan was different. It had one of the largest Russian populations outside Russia itself. Its leadership, under Nursultan Nazarbayev, initially supported preserving a reformed union. In March 1991, Kazakhstan voted to remain. It was the only republic to do so decisively, but history was moving faster than loyalty. When Russia itself, under Boris Yeltsin, began preparing for independence from the Union structure, the logic of preservation collapsed. Kazakhstan declared independence in December 1991. It became the last republic to leave. Even the most cautious participant could not hold together a structure that was dissolving from its center. By late 1991, the centrifugal forces were unstoppable. The Baltic states had shown defiance was possible. The Caucasus had shown Moscow could not contain internal conflict. Ukraine had delivered the strategic blow. And once Russia chose sovereignty over union, the Soviet Union no longer had a core. It had fragments. By the summer of 1991, the Soviet Union was barely holding together. Republics were declaring sovereignty, the economy was collapsing, Gorbachev was negotiating a new union treaty that would decentralize power even further. For hardliners inside the Communist Party, this was betrayal. They believed the state was being dismantled from within, so they decided to act. On August 19, 1991, while Mikhail Gorbachev was vacationing in Crimea, a group of senior officials declared a state of emergency. They claimed Gorbachev was ill. In reality, he was under house arrest. A committee calling itself the State Emergency Committee announced it had taken control. Tanks rolled into Moscow. Armored vehicles surrounded key government buildings. Television played Swan Lake on repeat, a signal to many that something was very wrong. For a moment, it looked like the old Soviet reflex was returning. Control, force, silence. But the country in 1991 was not the country of 1968. Something had changed. At the Russian Parliament building, the White House said the crowds gathered, and then an unexpected figure stepped forward. Boris Yeltsin, president of the Russian Republic. Not of the Soviet Union, but of Russia itself. He climbed onto a tank. He denounced the coup as unconstitutional. He called for a general strike. The image traveled instantly across the world. A civilian politician standing on a military vehicle, defying the old guard. Inside the armed forces, hesitation spread. Commanders were unsure. Soldiers were unsure. Many did not want to fire on civilians. The coup leaders had tanks, but they did not have momentum. And in revolutions, momentum is everything. After 3 days of confusion and growing resistance, the coup collapsed. Gorbachev returned to Moscow, but he returned weakened. Because the real winner of those days was not the Soviet presidency, it was Russian sovereignty. The Communist Party was suspended, its authority shattered. The republics accelerated their declarations of independence. From that moment on, the Soviet Union was no longer a superpower struggling to reform. It was a state dissolving in real time. After the failed coup, events moved quickly. Too quickly. On December 8, 1991, in a forest residence in Belarus, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met in private. Boris Yeltsin, Leonid Kravchuk, Stanislav Shushkevich. They did not negotiate reform. They did not renegotiate the Union. They declared it finished. The agreement stated that the Soviet Union, as a subject of international law and a geopolitical reality, has ceased to exist. No referendum across the entire Union. No grand ceremony. Just signatures. On December 25th, Mikhail Gorbachev addressed the nation one last time. He acknowledged the reality. The country he had tried to reform was dissolving. He resigned as president of the Soviet Union. That evening, the red flag bearing the hammer and sickle was lowered from the Kremlin. In its place, the Russian tricolor was raised. It was quiet. No civil war in Moscow, no final battle, no foreign invasion. After nearly 70 years, a superpower ended almost silently.
Я покидаю свой пост с тревогой, но и с надеждой, с верой в вас, в вашу мудрость и силу духа. Мы наследники великой цивилизации, и сейчас от всех и каждого зависит, чтобы она возродилась к новой, современной и достойной жизни.
The next day, the Soviet parliament formally dissolved itself. 15 republics became independent states. The Cold War's central actor vanished. The map of the world changed in a matter of weeks. And just like that, the experiment that began in revolution in 1917 came to an end in the winter of 1991, not with an explosion, but with exhaustion. When the Soviet Union disappeared, Russia did not become stable overnight. It inherited the symbols of superpower status, the nuclear arsenal, the permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council, the diplomatic recognition, but it also inherited something else: economic collapse. The centrally planned economy was dismantled rapidly. Price controls were lifted, state industries were privatized. The transition was supposed to be swift. Instead, it was chaotic. Inflation exploded. Savings evaporated almost overnight. Factories closed. Unemployment, once officially non-existent, became real. For millions of Russians, the 1990s felt not like liberation, but humiliation. State assets were sold at astonishing speed. Former insiders acquired oil fields, factories, media companies. A new class emerged, the oligarchs. While many struggled to survive, a few accumulated enormous wealth. Inequality widened dramatically. Crime increased. Life expectancy fell. The Soviet Union had promised stability, even at the cost of freedom. The 1990s delivered freedom without stability. Out of that instability, a new political direction would emerge. One that promised order, strength, national pride. But that is another chapter. The collapse of the Soviet Union did not simply redraw borders. It reshaped identities. 15 new states had to define themselves. Russia had to decide what it was without empire. And the consequences of that moment are still unfolding today. The Soviet Union did not collapse because of one battle, not because of one speech, not because of one enemy. It collapsed because the system that built it could not change without breaking. It was a superpower forged through control over its economy, over its republics, over its people. And when that control loosened, the structure that held it together began to come apart. Not all at once, but everywhere at once. Empires rarely fall in a single dramatic moment. They fall when the forces holding them together are weaker than the forces pulling them apart. The Soviet Union lasted nearly 70 years. It industrialized at breathtaking speed. It defeated Nazi Germany. It reached space. And then, almost quietly, it vanished. Fade to black.